sexual harassment, and a bunch of vetoes. We talk about it this week on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program where we talk about state government, politics, and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Hannah Meisel, reporter for Law 360. Welcome, Hannah.
Glad to be here.
And also Professor of Political Science Emeritus Kent Redfield from the University of Illinois, Springfield. Welcome, Kent.
Good to be here.
Great. Sexual harassment continues to be an issue both nationwide and here in the state of Illinois, and particularly in the General Assembly, where bills have been passed to combat the issue, and folks seem to perhaps be trying to get ahead of things. Let me start this out in somewhat of an unusual fashion, I guess. I read today a piece in the New York Times that was written by Diana Nyad, the famous swimmer who is the only person who has swum between Cuba and Florida. And she talked about an event in her life in which she says that she was involved a former coach, and it was very, very touching. And she had come forward before more than 10 years ago, and nothing had really been done about her accusations, and this person whom she'd accused, who is deceased now but remains in several swimming halls of fame. And that really, at least on a personal level, brought home to me that we're talking about a power structure here that is really slanted, perhaps in the wrong direction. And so that's not true, I think, just in Illinois, but nationwide. And so here in Illinois, what we've had is we have had women who have signed, and others, who have signed an open letter, this was a couple of weeks ago, saying that sexual harassment is rampant in Springfield and in the legislature, and that legislators have been involved in this sort of thing. The person who's come to light right now, who's most in the spotlight, is Senator Ira Silverstein, who has written, frankly, some fairly disgusting things to a lobbyist or to a person who was trying to get legislation passed. And it's not in doubt what the senator wrote. He actually put it down in writing in Facebook, and he remains a senator, and his future now is somewhat murky. There have been some calls for him to resign. Meanwhile, the legislature says we're going to do something about this. And so they have passed a bill that talks about we're going to do some things to combat sexual harassment. We are going to, in fact, they have last weekend, they appointed a state inspector, an inspector general to bring back perhaps the ethics commission, the legislature's ethics commission back to life. There's been no inspector general for the state legislative ethics commission for in excess of 2 years now. The question remains, I think, is how serious are they really taking this? And can this really change? And so I'd like to explore that for a moment, if we could. Professor, is this something that we can expect real change on? And if so, is it going to happen overnight? And how do you accomplish change in this kind of a climate, in this sort of a political culture?
Well, certainly the response has been very strong and very quick. And I think when the General Assembly moves very quickly on an issue, particularly with leadership, then you know that they really believe this is something out there that has legs, that has substance. And so they clearly want to be as quickly as possible to position themselves as responding. And clearly there has not been a legislative inspector general. It's kind of a low-paid position. The legislation was designed with all of these other inspector generals back at the end of the Blagojevich scandals, and it came out also the Ryan scandals and the Blagojevich scandals, and the emphasis was primarily on corruption. It wasn't, that's what they were responding to. They were responding to sexual harassment. So we've had mandatory ethics training, but now the legislature is, I think just this day or in the last day or yesterday, is going through ethics training, which is
sexual harassment training.
Sexual harassment training.
Anti-sexual harassment training.
which is not unusual for agencies, for universities, but I mean the other point is the legislature is been historically a very male-dominated institution, no question about it. The women in the legislature have tended to be secretaries, low-level staffers, and so in so much as sexual harassment is about power in terms of being able to assert power, then legislatures are, I think, particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment, and it's something that you have to pay a lot of attention to.
Do you think that there's any fear about what's next here? And part of the reason I bring this up is on the open letter, folks who were signed it were asked, do you have any experiences in your own personal life that have happened to you in the legislature, in Springfield, in state government? Would you be willing to talk about that? Would you be willing to talk about that to the media? What's your contact info? And we won't put you on Front Street until you say you're ready to go. What kind of a message does that send, and how might that have affected the reaction here? Hannah?
Yeah, I do think that the willingness of some women to come forward and talk about their experience has put people on notice that they might be next. Now, there is some debate in Democratic leadership, especially, over whether or not it's an effective way to name names. There's some debate over whether naming people is the more effective way, because, yes, to your question, I do believe that it's making people a little bit more cautious. Is it being taken seriously? You're going to have a wide range of personalities who are going to take these kinds of things more seriously, or some people will still laugh at it. Sexual harassment training, just doing one day of training with a slideshow. That's no matter how well intentioned that is, that's not going to change minds and hearts, I would say.
Yeah, and I will say, prior to the hearing at which Denise Rothheimer came forward and named names, or a name, I had contacted the offices of all 4 legislative leaders I asked 2 questions. I asked, 1, are you aware of any instance of sexual harassment, accusations involving a member of the legislature since January 1st of 2016? B, if so, how did you handle that? The Senate and the House Republicans said, we're not aware. Their Democratic counterpart said, we can't talk about that. That's confidential. And so I said, well, wait a minute. I'm not asking for names. I'm not asking, it's a yes or no question. We can't answer yes or no because that's confidential. Is that the right sort of approach to take?
Well, these things were designed, to police themselves. And the process, if you look at Inspector General processes all throughout state government, there's an awful lot of, confidentiality, I guess is the most neutral word, so that you have to get pretty far into a hearing on a case before it goes public. I mean, it is designed and perhaps, goes too far in that direction, that to lessen the chance that you're going to get somebody making a wild accusation that has no foundation, that's going to get in the newspaper and all of that. But you have to strike a balance, and there's no question the legislation was drawn, so that you have to get somebody get to the Inspector General, they have to sign off that there's real substance before you start to process these things. And then there's still an awful lot of secrecy unless you have a finding that there was in fact some kind of violation took place. So, and I think some of the substantive changes that they were trying to make in the legislation address that, but that's always it's always an issue.
Sure. I mean, the jury here the jury, so to speak, would be the Ethics Commission of the legislature, as I understand it, and that's 4 Ds and 4 Rs. What's the likelihood of somebody who was sexually harassed, and it is a power issue, as you point out. I mean, when Denise Rothheimer came forward, she had a lot to lose. I mean, and several women have said this, that you need access to legislators to get your issues heard and move forward in Springfield. And if you have to put up with things in order to keep that access open. If you are a victim of sexual harassment, is this the right way to handle it through this sort of an approach? Is there some other way to do it? There has been some suggestion that the legislature can't police itself. Hannah?
There are definitely other ways to do it, but then you also get into the question of separation of powers issues.
Okay.
In court cases that have bared themselves out in much larger arenas than this, there have been questions in ethics violations, not necessarily sexual harassment, but separation of powers issues, federal constitutional issues are called into question if it's seen that the executive branch is pointing the judicial branch to reach into the legislative branch to do something. And so it's hard, but I mean, clearly in the last 3 years without an inspector general, the speaker said the Legislative Ethics Commission is functioning, but they are, I mean, what does that mean? Like they're meeting every month, sure, but without an inspector general, they couldn't raise any of the complaints to, an actual case.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
there's no question you have to, you've got to get the process so that it's more responsive. You have to take it seriously enough to appoint an inspector general, which we didn't do. It is, although, I will speak up for just the idea of having training and, putting down those markers. When you go through training and you see and people talk about these are the actions, these are the situations, then you can't say, well, gee, I didn't know that. I mean, it seems common sense, but
it does seem common sense.
But lots of people don't look at it that way. And the other thing is, it's important for the institution to take a stand. If you're familiar with the, I'm not familiar with the military, but my understanding is that when they have a major screw up, then they will essentially have everybody under a particular command stand down, and they will go through the training. They will say, this is what we're supposed to be doing, and so it's a statement that we take this seriously. This is what we, this is how things had to be done. My university did that back in the, back sometime in the '80s when we had some issues involving both staff and faculty, and the university took a whole day to go through some training and group and discussion sessions, everything else. And the message was, we take this seriously. So it's important for the legislature to do that. Ultimately, it's hearts and minds. You've got to change attitudes.
I want to get back to something you said, Hannah, which is the statement by legislative leaders, particularly Madigan's office, that the Ethics Commission has been functioning. And I guess on one hand, you could say that it's been functioning as well as it ever has without an inspector general. The last inspector general had some very pointed remarks when he left, I believe, in the summer of 2013, saying this ain't working. The law is toothless. There's too many loopholes. I believe there were something like 3, maybe 4 published reports in 6 years or so, and folks who have been around Springfield and watched the legislature, that's hard to believe that there were 3 or 4 ethical violations in the space of 6 years. So we've now got an inspector general who's an interim inspector general. That should be pointed out. At the end of the day, is this just a Band-Aid, or do they need to really, if they're serious about this, revisit the issue of ethics and the Ethics Commission and address some of these issues that have actually been put out on the table years and years ago by the prior prior inspector general?
Well, the interim inspector general that they appointed last Saturday, her name is Julie Porter. She's a former U.S. attorney, now in private practice. She was around for Blagojevich things and some other investigations. She's not unfamiliar with the world of Springfield. And it's, while she doesn't want to be a permanent inspector general, she sounds very serious about going in there and taking up the complaints and looking back at them. And it also sounds like she's pretty serious about making recommendations for how it could actually run better.
Sure.
The former inspector general, he did say, yes, the law is pretty toothless. It needs a lot of improvement. And the legislature responded to that in the bills that they passed this week. For example, they made one of the former provisions is that you couldn't file a complaint on something that was less than a year old. And for the 3 years that the Inspector General role was not, there was no one there, complaints languished, and there's obviously complaints that are less than 3 years. So one of the provisions was making it so that you could look at things retroactively to
These 26 that
2014.
are out there, yeah.
Yeah. And there certainly are models in other states. There's models at the national level. I mean, you have standing committees within the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House, and you need to find individuals that are willing to defend the reputation of the institution, because that's really what ultimately, if it's just about protecting the Democrats, protecting the Republicans, protecting your friends, then if you're not defending the institution, then the institution loses its legitimacy, and that's really a problem in terms of nobody trusts government, and when you have these kinds of things, and then you find how weak and the law was and how it wasn't really being implemented. It just it just confirms that opinion that's out there that there really isn't a public interest that people are concerned about.
That's a really good point, because if you are experiencing these things and you know that your friends are experiencing these things, why would you file a complaint if you know it's going to fall on deaf ears? Why would you fill out the paperwork if you know that nothing's going to happen? And, like you said, then the trust in government erodes.
And let's talk about another thing here. One of the things that the folks have said in leadership is, we tried to get an inspector general. We're the 5th largest state in the union. I can't remember how many lawyers we've got, but we can't find anybody who wants the job. And everybody who's applied for the job isn't qualified to do the job. What does that say? You can't find anybody?
Well, if you've got a job
until now, but go ahead.
Yeah, you're paying somebody on basically an hourly basis. The person that has the real center of this. You've got a staff, of course, but and so you need to have again, if it were a standing committee, if it had a staff. If there are other models that where it can be we did it in a way to have inspector generals because we wanted independent people, but that's really saying we can't police ourselves. And other states and at the national level, they appoint standing committees on ethics. They take it seriously, and maybe we need another model.
Sure. Does this become a political issue? Is this something that only insiders care about? Does this carry over into the campaigns next year? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, you better believe it. I mean, look at, news coverage has been dominated with sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations, and just, talk about the whole culture for at least the last month. I think it's not going anywhere, and I do think that anyone who is caught doing anything improper or could be spun in a campaign ad that this person was protecting this other person who did something wrong. Oh yeah, that's definitely going to be.
And clearly the Governor Rauner is going to revisit some themes shaking up Springfield about the corruption in Springfield, and the Democrats have been in charge of the General Assembly for a couple of decades, and so it's ultimately the Democrats were they were the ones that were. I mean, it takes 3 votes of the 4 leaders to appoint somebody, but you can fairly ask: was this a priority of Madigan? Was this a priority of Cullerton? What does it say? And so that's part of the reason. I mean, people were surprised how quickly the speaker got out there. But he owns it, and so if they can't get it cleaned up, it becomes one more part of that narrative from the governor about how we need to get rid of that mess in Springfield.
Yeah. Right. Speaking of the governor, it was a mixed week for him. On the one hand, he prevailed in his right to work bill. We could talk about that for a second. But he also lost, was overridden, I believe, 8 times in the space of less than 10 minutes by the Senate on Wednesday, I believe, with bills ranging from debt transparency to writing cursive and teaching cursive writing in schools to regulations relating to roofers. Let's talk about the right to work thing first off. That's a victory for the governor. How significant is it?
I would say it's pretty significant for him. We saw the House was able to, the Republicans in the House, were able to keep their majority together to not let the Democrats take a win on this. We should say this legislation is a response to one small municipality that actually created an ordinance in suburban Lincolnshire to create a right-to-work zone. Now, this is one of the governor's signature issues, although he's toned back the rhetoric, of course, since he was first installed in office. But yeah, no, I think it's a decent victory for the governor.
Okay.
But it also speaks to the strength of House Republicans, even after a pretty rough summer.
Yeah.
And I mean, winning it is good for the governor. Losing it would have been a disaster.
Right.
Because he is saying, reelect me, I'm going to reform, things are going to happen, you got to trust me, I got it together. And then if the legislature passed over his veto a bill saying you can't have right-to-work zones, local right-to-work zones in Illinois, then that just, you want more evidence that the governor isn't competent.
Sure.
I mean, you could hear it all from the other side, and
Right.
so he really, really needed this one, and he got it, and that may have be partially explain why he got creamed on so many other substantive and non-substantive
Sure.
vetoes, because he really put the full court press on that.
Sure, he did. And speaking of the other vetoes, two at least stood out for me. One was the Debt Transparency Act, and that, frankly, I can see campaign commercials around this. The governor, with a straight face, vetoed a measure saying we got to know in real time how much money we have and how much we owe, and the governor had vetoed that. Any surprises there that the Senate said we need to know how much money we have and how much we owe in real time?
No, I mean, it was pretty popular, and also Comptroller Susana Mendoza, whose bill this was all along, she pushed very, very hard for it.
Sure.
And I think what we found out during the 2 years of budget crisis is that we don't actually truly know what
Right.
the state owes, because prior to this, agencies would only have to report but once a year, and they would withhold some things, and I mean not in an insidious way, but this is by and large people agree this is a good idea.
Sure. I mean, he didn't look. It could have been worse. It was 52-3. It could have been 0, but
Right. And the governor today, he was asked by one of our colleagues, do you regret vetoing? And he said, no, I don't regret it. But it's a question of did he veto it because he truly thought it was a bad idea, or did he veto it because it was Susana Mendoza
Right.
pushing it, who has been hammering the governor?
adding to his long list of public regrets while in
Right.
office. But go ahead.
Yeah,
Ken.
no, and I mean, the final total, because it was unanimous in the House, was like 167-3.
Right.
Now that's up there with the smackdown from the House against Rod Blagojevich's gross receipts tax. And so that's really the back of the hand of the legislature to the governor, and he lost. Not Senator Menard had a bill saying if substitute teachers work more than 10 days, then we'll refund the fee that they have to pay to be a substitute, to apply to being a substitute teacher. That one was unanimous. It got nobody supported the governor in either chamber, which is very, very unusual.
Sure.
Can't. And so and the list, the Attorney General had a bill on student loans that she got. Ferrix, the treasurer, had a bill on insurance companies looking for people who they owed money to in terms of death benefits. Of course, Mendoza had her bill. And so, there was part of this looks like the, kind of it does look partisan, and it does look like the governor was, going after the constitutional officers on the
Yeah.
other side of the aisle.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing that the governor did, he wasn't overridden on, was the Senate on Thursday was not able to override the governor's veto on this bill that would prohibit a business from asking year prior salaries from other jobs. Okay. The theory being that it would help women to not have low salaries follow them throughout.
Sure, to do something about comparable worth.
Right, right. Yeah. So the House was able to, override it in a pretty comfortable margin. I believe it was 80-something. But the Senate on Thursday were not. I think it was 29 yes when they needed 36.
Yeah, great.
Which also was Dan Biss's bill, who was running for governor,
right,
on the Democratic side. So there's always a partisan angle.
Always a partisan angle. And we're running out of time, but I do want to bring one. And this was my full disclosure. I liked that this one. Cursive writing. Love cursive writing. I mean, this is right here, folks. This is what it looks like. And the governor had vetoed a bill that wouldn't, and that was overridden, so that schools will now have to teach cursive writing. That seemed to me to be a head scratcher why that got vetoed. Folks have accurately pointed out that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are written in cursive writing, and otherwise, how would kids know how to read it in their own hands? But again, we're running out of time. But that bill, I mean, what explains that? Because in some sense, it's froth and silliness, but.
And you could make an argument about unfunded mandates and local control, but it just seems, you don't want to lose too many in a row, or you start to get a reputation, and people start to question your competence and stuff. So you got to pick your battles.
Pick your battles.
Yeah.
And speaking of battles, our battle now is with time, and we're losing it. So we are out of time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.